ago, I was a lunch staffer in Washington for California. But it's wonderful, wonderful, and it's a great privilege to get to do. So I'm sure you see that. Good.
Okay, everyone, I think there's more food coming here. Just grab the food, whatever you like. I think there will be more coming. And we'll try to start in a couple minutes.
That's so that's incredible.
Okay, let's get seated and we can start the program.
How's it going? Good. That's my evil twin. So. Thank you. Good work to get to do. Thank you. I'll follow your instructions. Really? Right on. Yes. Are you a Taurus? Yeah. Okay, good. That's right. I didn't realize that. So we all have the same. But you're younger than I am. No, you are definitely. I look older. I was older. Good to see you.
Okay, well, I'd like to introduce her. Okay, this is Rebecca.
Thank you.
Okay, let's get seated and Kind of, there's more food coming. If you need more food, just come here, grab some. I think we can start our program so that we can end on time. First, thank you everyone for coming to our sixth Civic Leadership Forum. You know, we had this every month, and because June, July, usually people, you know, go out to travel. I want people enjoy the summer, so we kind of pause for this, those couple months, and this month we're coming back to resume our Civic Leadership Forum. And before I talk about this forum, I have like have some event I want to let everyone know. On August 19th, actually this next Saturday, 11 to 2 o'clock at Delwell Regional Park in Livermore, we'll have the barbecue for all members, volunteers, interns, their families. Everyone is welcome, and just enjoy free food, drink, and enjoy the weather, the lake, and then make a good friend. Okay, next I think I'd like to invite Anthony to come up here. You know, Anthony is from the Civic Leadership Forum. They are the sponsor of this event. So thank you, Anthony, so much for sponsoring this event. So Anthony is very busy, kind of travel all over the country, kind of sponsoring different candidate forum or civic leadership forum, and try to promote more people to come out to participate. So let's give a few minutes for Anthony.
Thank you for the intro. Well, I see a lot of familiar phrases. That means that you've been here before, and some of the speaker, and I just want to thank you because Andy have been doing this since last year, and very systematic, giving us the solid information how to get engaged civically. And I'm Anthony Ng, by the way, CLF Foundation's Executive Director. Our one mission is using Civic Leadership Forum as a platform to train and connect civic leaders around the countries. We need good people, and we need it together, because I want to use that same phrase that I used in DC last month. If you want to be fast, fly alone, but if you want to go far, fly together, because we can lift each other up while we're doing that. It is going to be a long battle, long journey, and also it is not just all the way in the White House in DC. Everything happening local are very important too. Without that infrastructure, we could not do anything. So I thank you for participation. So be on the table, or you'll be on the menu.
Thank you, Anthony. And today we're very honored to have Assembly Member Catherine Baker, and she's very supportive to Papa and attended many of our events, so thank you so much. And I think I would like Cindy to introduce her, but before that I want to talk a few things, or just maybe one thing. So I want to check everyone, who is from Saramon? Okay, we have quite a few. You know, I'm a resident in Saramon. I always tell other people I'm very proud of Saramon. We have a very good school, very safe city, and we are one of the richest city in the country. So we're very proud of. But living in Tri Valley, I think most of people or all the people live in Tri Valley. And when living outside of Tri Valley, no, okay. You know, in Tri Valley, I just kind of just came to my mind when Bill Clarkson, the Saramon mayor, talked about at our intern graduation ceremony, and when he talked about more the kind of you know, this nowadays the country, even the state, Democrats fight with Republicans, and but I'm very proud of here. We are kind of one of the best area here in the Tri Valley. Why? Those two Republicans and Senator Glazer is the Democrat. They are good friends. They work together. They don't fight at all. Have you ever gone go out to have a drink with him together?
We play foosball.
Oh, okay, you play football. So they really enjoyed and kind of a good friend, have a lot of event together instead of, just go to the capital, just fight together. So we made a really good example for the California and for the whole nation. I hope the whole nation, California, can learn from this. Then we all more work on the issue instead of the more bipartisan, you stand on this side and say, I have to fight with you. So this is why, I say I'm very proud of this area. So thank you, Catherine, so much for being kind of very moderate and very involved in the local community. In the past, people don't see like assembly member participate so many events, but you are one of the exceptions. So really good. The next, I would like to have Xinyi and Assembly Member Catherine Baker's intern to introduce her. I think she knows you much better than me, so it's
the inside stuff.
Yeah. So you can tell some inside story. Okay.
So I was told to do this like when I walked in at 5:30, so I don't really know what to say, but I guess I will introduce our wonderful Assemblywoman. So she was elected to her position in 2014, even as a Republican in California's Sea of Democrats. And she currently represents the California 16th District, which consists of Loma Linda, Tri-Valley, and, this area. And she sits on 5 committees. Sorry, I don't have this memorized, including the Committee of Business and Professions, the Committee of Higher Education, the Committee of Privacy and Consumer Protection, the Committee of Transportation, and this had another name, but here it says Legislative Audit, so something like that. I'm sorry. I don't really know what I'm saying, so without further ado, please welcome Assemblywoman Catherine Baker.
Thank you. And I am very grateful again to Xinyi for being such a wonderful part of our office these last several weeks, and also to Andy and Apapa. They're really quality programs that Apapa in this chapter's short life have been very productive, and ones that I think help promote not only civic engagement but connection within our community, the ability to know one another, know what goes on. What is San Ramon government? What is county government? What are some of the offices that people work in? What are all parts of our community that we all can be connected with? And so not every community has these types of programs. They don't have either a chapter that has the type of thriving activity you do, or even a leadership program that talks about this to keep us connected. So thank you, and everyone, for coming tonight. And definitely, if you want to refill your plate, I do not want to be the only thing between you and delicious fried food. So please feel free to skip on back and grab some. Andy asked if I could speak tonight a little bit about what does an assembly member do in general in the legislature. What's a typical day like? What are the responsibilities and issues that we confront, and where does it fit in with the California government? And but also what state government is a little bit like. But I also want to be sure to open up for questions, so it's not too much of a long monologue for me. Just questions about any issues that you see in the area, and to learn more about this. A lot of times 4th grade classes, because in 4th grade our students study California history and California government, they come and do a field trip up to the Capitol. And one of the first questions I ask is, do you know what an assembly member does? And they've generally studied the basics, and they might be able to say, well, you write bills. But my favorite answer is, well, don't you assemble things? You assemble things, right? So you're like a manufacturer. And that's not entirely inaccurate. It's true. As an assembly member, I'm part of a legislative body, the Assembly. There's also the Senate in our legislature in Sacramento that has 80 assembly members. There are 80 districts. They are drawn up by population primarily, so we each represent about 465,000 people in our assembly districts. On the Senate side, they represent about twice as many. They represent almost 1 million people. And of the 80 assembly members, I am in District 16. We call it the Sweet 16. It's also my daughter's soccer jersey. And Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president, so it's one of my favorite numbers. And we represent this area in state government. And what that means is a couple of components. We write legislation and we vote on each other's legislation that can affect just about any area or aspect of your life. Transportation, housing, education, water, electricity, whether or not there are going to be cell towers on your local city street and what the rules are for that, tax policy, social services to help those in our community who need a helping hand, and land use and environmental law. A lot of that happens in the state. Most folks hear a lot about our terrific Congress members, or they might hear about our local mayors, but then there's this level at the state government, and it touches a lot of your daily life. This district does include the towns that Cindy mentioned, so La Miranda, which means Lafayette, Moraga, and Orinda, most of Walnut Creek, and then down the 680 corridor, Alamo, Danville, San Ramon, and Dublin, Pleasanton, Livermore. It goes all the way out to where the 205 and the 5 split off, and all the way up to the Caldecott Tunnel. You almost define it by the freeways that we have to drive on, 24, 680, and 580. The community is one that is very, very diverse, not only by ethnic and racial, but also it's suburban. It's also rural and semi-rural. We have major corporations like Chevron and Safeway that are based in our area. We have big shopping and retail like downtown Walnut Creek and Livermore, but then we also have cattle grazing and wine country, all within about 45 minutes. I can get from one end of the district to the other in 45 minutes. Cindy Chin, my district director, might dispute that, but that is, I've done it, maybe 50 minutes. Sort of these assembly districts that we represent, so can be very diverse in a lot of different ways, economically, demographically, even where their space is. I would say about half the people who work outside of their home and live in this district commute outside of the district, so to San Francisco, to other parts of the East Bay, to Silicon Valley, and half live and work in this community. And I am a sophomore. So I've had one term as a freshman. I was first elected in 2014, re-elected in 2016. Assembly members have 2-year terms, very similar to Congress. We run for re-election every 2 years for a maximum amount of time of 12 years. And so that's just a little bit of background for every assembly member, what they have. I serve on the committees I serve on because I work in a few key areas for policy, infrastructure. So transportation and water and energy, sort of the backbone of our state. Things that you shouldn't have to think about to live your life, but you probably have to think about transportation every single day. Second area is education. I'm a parent of school-age kids. Many of you have met them. My twins start high school on Monday, which is freaking me out a little bit. But parent of school-age children, very active in education, vice chair of the Higher Education Committee, and then work on what I just call good, responsible government. Get your budget in order, spend your money as wisely as you can, be disciplined about your spending and your regulations, and keep our streets safe. That's, to me, is a good government role. Different assembly members will list different issues than what I have just listed. Some represent very different areas. Say they might represent the Central Valley, where many of the people there are in farming and agriculture, and their priorities are water, agriculture, and land use. So as an assembly member, I will probably vote 5,000 times in my 2-year term. I think last year I voted about 4,400 times, but now every assembly member can introduce 50 bills. It used to be only 40, so I'm planning on voting on more bills. And that's a lot of voting. What we're doing is we're voting on the legislation that we write or that our colleagues write. Another big part of that is needing to specialize, because if I'm voting on 5,000 bills, I do read the bill materials for every bill. It is why I desperately need reading glasses, constantly updated, with a great team of people who help me analyze the bills. But members have to specialize in an area, and that's how we end up on committees. We request committees that will specialize in a certain policy area. So I will have colleagues who are on the insurance committee, and they have a much more in-depth familiarity with insurance law that affects your daily life. But they won't sit on the higher education committee like I do, which governs all of our university system and community college, both private and public and for-profit in the state of California. And so assembly members go up to Sacramento and they specialize in a few key areas. We are voting on one another's legislation. And then when we're not in Sacramento, we should be working in our districts and working for outreach. Andy mentioned that you might kind of be getting tired of seeing me around. There's an evil twin of mine that is also out there a lot. But it's important that I think assembly members and anyone in public office is out in their communities, both gathering information about what's important in the community and providing a public service. Every assembly member may do that differently. The way I do is we have a lot of town halls and public forums where we are just letting people ask questions and what we do and weigh in on issues. And we also do a lot of advisory councils. Some of you serve on some of the advisory councils I have. For me, advisory councils are a way in which I get information from members of the community who may have an experience or an expertise totally different from mine, but I'm going to vote on bills related to that, and so I really welcome their input. Some of them are advisory councils on policy areas like transportation or water or gun control or education, and others may be demographic groups that I don't share that same background, but I really value the input of those groups. And so that's an important part of the daily life I have, is having those meetings with those groups that advise on legislation. And the third part that I mentioned was outreach. And this is having events that don't take a bill or a bureaucracy, but serve a value in our community. Some of us tonight were just talking about we sponsor a program, and I often do them with other members, maybe a congressional office or a local mayor, or Senator Glazer sometimes, and I do this, where we have a joint program and we bring in as speakers on a program that people can hear from. We do one on college financial planning. How can families early on start to think about how they're going to plan for the financing of college? Our kids and our families get a lot of information about here's how to prepare for applying for college. You got to afford it. And how can you get to scholarship programs and otherwise? We do programs on car seat safety check for families because there are really rigid state rules on what type of car seats you're allowed to have for what size child and for what age. How about doing a program on how to make sure your car seat is there safely? We do a self-defense workshop. We do town halls where you're hiking out in the community. I know Andy's gone to some of those and some other members. We call them walk and talk town halls. This is what an assembly member can do to get information from their community on what's important and how can we be a voice for the community in Sacramento, where the capital is. So there's bills and legislation that we write and we vote on a variety of issues that affect your daily life. And then there's outreach and public information and interaction with constituents that is foundational to how we know when we're up in Sacramento voting on 5,000 things, what would be in the best interest of our community. Those are a big part of what any assembly member does, I think should do. I'll try to read some of the things that are not in the textbooks on how a bill becomes a law. I'm a member of the minority party in Sacramento, so I work very hard across the aisle in order to get things done. For one thing, I am in the minority, and there aren't enough people in my party if I just wanted to rely on them to pass legislation. But more importantly, the major challenges facing our state can really only be fixed in the best way if people from all perspectives are at the table. If you only want to hear from one viewpoint, you will have a very narrow solution, generally. And even if you can get it passed into law. And so a lot of the work that I do, and there are other members like this, Senator Glazer is one, but there are other members, is to try to work across the aisle and put the party politics aside. I mention this point because what's different about an assembly level of office is it is partisan office. So some of the programs you've heard from in this leadership program are from those who are at, I wouldn't say lower levels of government, but more local levels. They are in nonpartisan office. That means when they run for office, their party affiliation is not listed at the end of their name, whether it's a D or an R or any other. That's not generally on there. It's maybe their job title and what they're running for. starting at the state level of office, so state assembly, Congress, and statewide office, Secretary of State or governor or lieutenant governor, those are partisan offices, and that means that you list the party you are a member of. And the idea is that you will caucus with your party, you'll work together with them in that capacity. So that's what's a little bit different about state level of government. Once you make that bump from the more localized level, for whatever reason, that seems to be a defining point. And in Sacramento, the legislature is also divided by party. It's not just that there's an assembly and a Senate. There is the majority party and the minority party. The Speaker of the Assembly, who determines generally, I'm simplifying, what bills we get to vote on, both in committee and on the floor, is a member of the majority party. He's a he right now, picks who sits on what committee, where they sit on the assembly floor, and where their offices are. He will take the input of the minority party's leader. We elect a leader, then they work together, but ultimately the Speaker gets to decide. It's very similar in Congress, which happens to be majority Republican right now. The Speaker kind of runs the show. That is the same in the legislature. So it's very different than a city council. When you go to city council, there aren't members who caucus or organize with the Democrats or organize with the Republicans, at least not overtly. And I would say in our community, it tends to be much more nonpartisan. There are other parts of the state where it's not. But at the state level, there's not only organization by what branch of government you're in, it's what party are you a member of. And that makes the challenge to do service for your community that is separate and apart from party. For example, I am a lifelong Republican, but I'm not the Republican Party's representative to my district. It goes the other way. I'm the district's representative to Sacramento. And that's our job and the way it's supposed to be. So that's a little bit of overview of the legislature, roughly what we do. I can spend a few seconds on a typical day, if that is of interest. I have two types of days, and they're all good days. This is good work. They're the days when I'm in Sacramento voting, and I'm in hearings listening to testimony about bills and voting in committee on bills, or I'm on the assembly floor debating with members and voting on legislation, or I'm back here in the district. When I'm up in Sacramento, and I have a little bit different schedule than some members, I'm very grateful I don't have to fly across the country as Congressman DeSaulnier does, but I usually drop off my kids at school and drive up to Sacramento each day. I have the miles on my minivan to show for it. It's very healthy to do that, by the way, just as I'll go off the freeway briefly. It is a bubble in the Capitol. You are in a bubble where everyone says, hello, ma'am. Disturbs me. Hello, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Good to see you. Everyone thinks you're the greatest thing since sliced bread, and then you got to get home, where your family will keep you very well grounded. But I drive up to Sacramento and begin the day preparing for hearings where I'm going to be voting on legislation, meeting with my staff about that, and meeting with constituents or groups that have a position on those issues and they want to share that with us. Yes, those are lobbyists, but there are also other people who are not lobbyists. That's a big part of the day in Sacramento, is hearings, floor debate, and voting on the floor, and then meeting with those who have an interest in legislation. Hop back in the car, come back, go to an APAPA event in the evening, free plug there, or other community events where we're maybe celebrating members of our community who've had a great milestone or great success, or having some of those advisory council meetings with constituents that I've talked about, and then the next day start again. We are in session in the legislature Monday through Thursday. And then Friday and Saturday, I'm usually here all day in the district. And Sunday I try to just be home, and I often let that go elsewhere. So that's the one type of day, is focused on votes in Sacramento, and the other ones are here in the district. And today's a good example, where our district office is in San Ramon. Proud to be in the heart of the Assembly District in Bishop Ranch. And I will meet with constituents throughout the day. Started the day off at 9 o'clock with constituents from Danville, meeting about a gun control bill that they have a very strong position on, and they wanted to let me know and have us exchange questions. And then went to additional meetings throughout the day. I've been working very hard on some legislation that I hope will be very good for our transportation in this area, a new parking structure at the BART station in Dublin, and a connection between the BART train and the ACE train along the 580 corridor to help with our transportation infrastructure. And even though I'm not in Sacramento, I'm working with members of the community on that legislation there. So a lot of just meetings. And then events like tonight where we get to visit and celebrate good things happening. That is a simplification of my life as an assembly member and what we've been working on. I think I talked about the issues I really focus on. There are a lot of other key issues. The state has a 178 very large budget, $1 billion budget. And we vote on that every year. So that's part of the work that will come out of Sacramento. Not just bills that I might write about whether or not to have a parking structure or protect some open space in Livermore, but bills about how money is spent at the state level. And finally, where does that money come from? It comes from you. Your income tax is a large portion of what funds the state budget. You'll see it on your paycheck. And for those of you interns who are getting those someday, you will see it on your paycheck. And there are many other fees and taxes that are paid to the state that then are part of our budget. Aside from the legislature, there's also the executive branch. And there's a lot of departments just like at the federal level. The Department of Transportation, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Housing. Many departments that focus on those issues for the state of California. What's a little bit different also at the state level than maybe a local or federal level is you also have a lot of consumer protection related departments. These are departments that if you have a licensed business, for example, you're in real estate. And if you're in real estate, you have to get a business license, and that's for the state to decide if you have passed all the ethical exams and you are abiding by the rules for being a realtor in the state of California. The same thing for being a barber or for being a doctor or a lawyer. There's many licensed business that the state of California requires, and they monitor those professions to try to ensure consumer safety and protection. They get very behind in that. But that's another role of state government that you don't often hear about, but that's part of the state level. I know Anna wanted me to talk a little bit about that. And with that, that is what I assemble. That is part of being an assembly member. It is wonderful, wonderful work. It is a true honor to drive into the building and this beautiful Capitol that was built shortly after the Civil War, and to work with colleagues on issues and try to address problems and affect the quality of life for Californians. And it is wonderful work to be in the district meeting with constituents and learning what can we do to be serving one another. And with that, it's a lot of my voice, so I want to be sure to open up for questions. They can be on issues or the role of an assembly member or anything you like. If I don't think it's a good question, I will be shocked, because this group has always had great questions. So let her rip. Yes?
Yeah, so it seems like you have to vote on a lot of very complex issues. So from my point of view, it seems like you have to be an expert on a lot of complex issues. I was wondering if you could share how you educated or prepared yourself for
Sure. Great question. A lot of complex issues. How do you get, educated on them so you feel you can really make the right decision? And it starts with a great team of people. I have, I think, the absolute best staff in the Capitol and in the district office. They work very, very hard to be in touch with our community and to research the bills and have background information. I also am a lawyer by background, which doesn't mean I know all the laws. It just means I cross-examine everybody who comes and asks me to do something to justify why. But it starts a couple different ways. The first is there are many also staff in the building who don't work for a particular member's office, but they work for a committee. So why don't I give this a concrete example? Transportation. I serve in the Transportation Committee, and that committee has staff that only specialize in transportation. And so they will read the bills and write an analysis. My staff will read the bills and provide additional information, and then I will read them and their analyses. And that's one way, is just do your homework, but rely on good professional staff. Bless you. Another way is meeting with people who have an interest in that legislation. That is a part of representative work. I'll tell you, transportation is an example. Folks will ask to make an appointment with me in our district office or in the Capitol to talk about a bill that might raise your gas tax or allocate how gas fees will be spent. And the bill that I voted on about this in the spring, SB1, was 107 pages long. Very manageable to read that. I mean, there are bills that are longer. Most people who come in and visit with us don't necessarily read the bill, but they might have a lobbyist, or they might work in a field where they specialize in transportation, and they will share their perspective with me. So it's reading the material and working with the staff on the analysis that they've done. It's listening to the groups that are opposed and for it. Some people will only meet with folks who are of their mind already on the bill. I try to meet with both sides of an issue, if time permits, and read the analysis from both the Republican staff and the Democratic staff. Interestingly, if you're a Democratic staff member, your analysis generally only goes to Democratic members, and only the Democratic members read it. Same thing with Republicans. I find it valuable to read both of the analyses because it's kind of interesting. They have a different take on issues. Then the third way of trying to know an issue is to have, as I mentioned, public forums and these little policy groups that are made of constituents and neighbors, and trying to anticipate when those bills are coming up so I can meet with them and ask. There are times where I will pick up the phone the night before a bill is going to be voted on, and I'll call a local mayor and I'll say, how will this affect Danville? Do you know, have you looked at this bill? How will it affect Danville? Or there were several gun control bills last year, and I called a lot of people who were for gun control and who were against it on the phone to talk with them about the bill. And so that's how you get familiar with it. There's a heavy reliance on information from other people. I will just say that. You got to be honest about that. When you're going to vote on 5,000 things, what's really important is you have quality people that you trust and listen to, and that you yourself have the presence of mind to ask the questions that you think need to be asked. You have the full picture. And often those questions are, what does the opposition say? Ask the people who are for the bill, what would your opponent say? And then and see how they do that. And you find out what groups support and oppose things, because they tend to represent a viewpoint that you need to take into account. So that's part of it. And some are very straightforward and easy. I will tell you, I'll look at some and I'll say, I know this issue very well because it's something I've studied carefully, and you have immediately a real sense of what might work or not work for your district. There are others that are really hard to understand. And those are the ones that take a lot more. Hopefully you'll put that time into it. So, yeah. Thank you. Yes?
3 questions.
All right, 3. The trifecta.
The first one is easy. Earlier you mentioned Congress member has a term of 12 years. So what happens when you turn out?
Sure. It's assembly members have a maximum. There aren't term limits for Congress at the federal level, but at the state level, whether you're a senator or an assembly member, a maximum amount of time you can serve in either of those two bodies combined is 12 years. And many people divide that. There's some people who run for assembly, and after 6 years, they want to run for Senate. And so they have 6 more years they can be there. And so that generally depends. At the end of the 12 years, when members are termed out, that's what that's called, they can't run anymore, it depends on what the member wants to do next. They may want to run for other office. Sometimes they run for supervisor at a localized level that doesn't have term limits. Sometimes they run for Congress or Board of Equalization, many different levels of office, and usually they run for something else, I'm just going to be honest. Sometimes they might say, my service is done, and they move into something else. So,
Wilma Chen is an example.
Beg your pardon?
Wilma Chen.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that is a good example. So, and Fiona Ma. I think she was an assembly member and then a senator, but she served in the legislature. She termed out, ran for Board of Equalization. She's termed out of that and now is running for treasurer. I think she's treasurer. So, yeah, good.
Wilma ran 12 years and then come back to Alameda County.
Okay, good, a supervisor. So, yeah, right?
Second question, you said you are a member of the minority group.
Yes.
What determines majority group?
Oh yeah, thank you for that clarification. The minority party, which in California and in the legislature is Republican, The majority party is Democrat. Different than Congress right now, the majority party, which is just basically who has more seats. Are there more of Democrats or Republicans? That makes you in the majority or the minority. And Republicans are really in the minority in California in the legislature, but in Congress, they're in the majority. Yeah, good question.
Well, how do we avoid conflict of interest? Say you are the developer, so that's gonna benefit you. Let's go ahead with that bill.
Great question. Great. How do, as an assembly member, avoid a conflict of interest? Well, first of all, we have ethical rules that when we're sworn in, we have to abide by those ethical rules. And we have many regulations on us that set guidelines, not only for conflict of interest, but other standards of behavior. Some of them are financial related. The Fair Political Practices Committee, FPPC, it is a state agency that monitors campaign spending that members have, as well as every year I have to release a Form 700, we know it by number, of all the financial assets and interests that I have and make it public to everyone so that it's public and transparent, which is very important. You shouldn't just take people's word for it. You can take mine, but still, it's important to have that. And we cannot vote on a bill that we may personally benefit from the financial outcome. And there's ethical rules, and we get training once a year on these ethical rules to make sure we're up to date on them when we think of it. What I do is I make sure all of my staff knows before I vote, these are the financial holdings that I have, my 401k or whatever, so that if there's a bill that affects this company that I might own a little piece of that I recuse myself. I don't vote on it. The rule is very narrow because let's say it's a bill on drones. Drones. And let's say most of the drones are operated by Google. And let's say an assembly member owns a little stock in Google. But there are other companies that also do drones. The assembly member could probably vote on the bill because it affects more than one company, not just that one. But the more, I try to go with the judicial standard that judges have, which is if there's an appearance of impropriety, even if there's appearance of it, don't do it. And so far there's only one bill I know of this year that puts me in that position that it just, you know what, I've gotten all the legal and ethical rulings saying you could totally vote on this, it's within the rules. I'm like, it's close enough. And I have a note on my voting button on my desk on the assembly floor, do not vote on this bill. It's one of the few times I will abstain, is you should recuse yourself and abstain. That's kind of probably a simplistic answer, but that's how you're supposed to do it. Yeah. Good question. Yes.
Question is very interesting. Say, for example, you are in the transportation committee, and then a lot of transportation, the bill related to the land development.
Yes.
And then if the land development is your big supporter,
right? Yeah.
And then now there's a kind of very subtle conflict, obvious conflict.
Yeah. And that can come up. That's one of the reasons why so much of our system is reliant on disclosing information. For example, disclosing everyone that's someone who's in elective office. And these rules apply to someone who runs for city council. They're bound by the same campaign finance rules that I'm bound by. And that is you disclose, here's everyone who's contributed something to me, and you can see every vote I've ever taken, so that you can decide for someone, here's an assembly member who's had a lot of people who, as you say, who are developers, contribute to them, and they voted on a bill that's good for developers. I know that's a conflict of interest. You like to hope that they only vote on what's good policy, and the developers support people that, support good policy. I'll let you decide how that reasoning goes. But that's why transparency is such an important part in disclosing the information. I would say if you make a case too narrowly that you've received contributions, or this assembly member's received contributions from developers, and their bill to improve transportation, which then means that someday more houses may be built where this developer wants, that gets a little bit attenuated, and pretty soon you vote on nothing and you can't make any progress. So that's why I think the best medicine, I often say this, the best cure for issues is sunshine and disclosing all that information. And it's actually a very contentious issue in the legislature. There's a bill I voted on last year. I think I was one of 2 Republicans to vote for it. It could come up again this year, which was to make sure that even more is disclosed. And it's one that may be coming up in just a few weeks. And it's a squeaker of a bill. It did not make it out of the Senate last year. I voted for it in the Assembly. And it was to make sure that more information about donors was disclosed. And the reason it didn't make it out is because there are very powerful interests that fund campaigns. And they want to sometimes get, maybe not around the rules, but they want to make sure that they're not put at a disadvantage to another set of groups. And I just think everybody should have to disclose it. And then you've got the information. The media has the information, and you hope you have it out there. Anyway, we're getting into the hearts of the cards stuff. This is good. So, other good questions?
So I do have a question. So, look like that you voted 5,000 bill in 5 years on average, like 3 years.
Every 2 years.
Oh, every 2 years.
Yeah, I expect to vote on about 5,000 things between this first year, 2017, and 2018, my full 2-year term.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you do have to read every bill.
Yes, and the analyses. There are many members who do not. They rely on the staff analysis, and there are some bills that, again, a member has seen in committee, so they voted on it there, they got to vote on it there, so that when it comes back to the floor, I will tell you what I look for is, has it been amended since I last voted on it? And if it hasn't, and it's the same, okay, I may not read it again. If it has changed, I look at how it changed. I may not open the page and read the whole thing over again. That's one of the ways you get through that. So we vote on a lot of those votes. A lot of those 5,000 are in committee. Yeah.
So are those bills public available for
Yes,
people?
they are. They are. And you can go to my website for a link. There's a link on my website that says, here's how you find out about a bill. You can always call our office, and we'll provide you with a copy of the bill. There's actually a very important rule that was just passed last November in the November election. It was an initiative that says you must, before a member votes on a bill, it must be public, meaning published on the website for the state of California for at least 72 hours. Super, super important rule, because in my first term, when this rule was not in place, there would be days where I'm sitting on the assembly floor and the rules about how quickly a bill could get to the floor were waived. So I have put in front of me a summary of the bill and am asked to vote on it about 3 minutes later. And so those are times when you don't get to read the bill. I will tell you that. That usually happened when we were right before a deadline by which if all these votes didn't happen, the bills all were going to die. It's a little bit different than in Congress, where a member of Congress can introduce a bill whenever they want, at the beginning of their term or on the very last day, and they can vote on a bill at any time. The legislature in California is very different. We have deadlines by which you have to introduce your bill for the entire year. I have to introduce them by the middle of February, and if I hadn't, it's not happening. And then it has to get out of a committee by April. It's got to get off the assembly floor by the end of May. It has to come back from the Senate by the middle of July, and then it has to get on the governor's desk by the middle of September. We have all these deadlines, and if one of them is missed, the bills die. So what happens? It's just like a procrastinating high school student. They wait until the deadline. So there could be a week when I have only one vote, and then a few weeks later I have 400 votes in a day. Well, it's usually, the most I think I've had in a day is like 200, because they jammed it all in. That made the 72-hour rule extremely important, because I would like to read the bills that I'm voting on. I have to otherwise rely on all my connection with the community to try to channel the district and say, all right, here's the summary of the bill, here's what I know about my district, you do the best you can. Now there's a 3-day rule, so hopefully we get to see it, and then the outside world gets to see it and call us and weigh in. The only thing about that 72-hour rule is the way that my colleagues have interpreted it is they narrowed it to say only when it's the final version of the bill, which means for an assembly member, it has gone all the way through the assembly, it went over to the Senate, went all the way through the Senate, and came back over to me. And that's not what the initiative said. The initiative said when I vote on something, it should be in print for 3 days. So, and sometimes they waive that rule by majority vote. So there's sometimes folks still try to get around the rule. It can be inconvenient, but that is the rule. Anyway, you got a long sermon from me on that. But yes. And I do get a lot of help from staff to analyze these bills and see what the vote recommendations are and get a copy of them. And it does require a lot of work and reading, and it's important. So, and I geek out about it, so it's good. Yes?
So if an important issue comes up in June, you have to wait till the next year to even bring up a bill?
Great question. If an important issue comes up in June, do you have to wait until next year? In general, yes. There's a couple ways to deal with that. One is you can put in your bill what's called an urgency clause. That urgency clause says, this is important. We need to address this right away, and when the governor signs it, we need it to become effective right away. Those urgency clauses require a 2/3 vote and not just a majority vote. And that's why it's not often done to have an urgency clause. That's one way in which that's dealt with. The second one is waiving the rules, where the people in the legislature have to decide, and the Constitution has to be written in a way to allow us to do this, that we waive that rule. There's another important thing that came up, we waived the rule. Our state constitution, you've seen the federal constitution, it's not that long. The state constitution is like this thick. It's a big book. When I give it out to 4th graders when they come up, so here's a copy of the state constitution for your light reading entertainment. It may tie our hands into the types of bills we can do that for, but that's generally how you deal with that. And a third way is, it's called gut and amend. It does not sound like a pretty process, and it's not. Let's say I have a bill that I introduced, and it got all the way through the process by all the deadlines. And some emergency happens. And the bill that would deal with that emergency didn't make it through the process. I don't think I can get 2/3 vote to have that urgency clause. So what some people will do is they'll amend the bill that made it through and take all the contents out, gut it, and they put new language in that is a different bill. That's called gut and amend. That's another way in which you get around that. And it sounds ugly. Anything you're gutting is not good. But it needs to be something that's transparent, and you need to have at least 3 days to read things before you vote on it. Last year, people would gut and amend something in the morning, and a half an hour later, I have to vote on it, and I've got about 3 minutes to read it. Not advisable. So, yes?
Can someone call for, or someone, how to determine, can have a special meeting for the bill, like emergency? Who can decide?
Who decides if...
what's the criteria?
So who decides if something is an urgency bill or
a special meeting?
A special meeting?
Special vote.
Yeah, if it has to have a 2/3 vote, or just if it's going to come up quickly. A couple different ways. When bills come up are decided both by our Constitution, which says bills have to go through certain steps, and the earliest they can then be voted on in the Assembly or Senate floor is determined. And the other way is the party that has majority power decides if the bill comes up. So I have some bills in the Senate that made it all the way through the Assembly, because that's where I introduced them. They've come all the way through committee, and they're waiting to be heard on the Assembly floor. The only thing they're waiting for is for the Assembly majority to say, okay, now is time to vote on these bills. That's one of the things about being in the majority party. You get to decide which bills get to come up for a vote. And if you don't like a bill, you can kill it in committee by not having enough majority votes to get it out of committee onto the floor, or you can just say, it's nice that you did that, but we don't want to vote on it. That doesn't happen that often, and I will say, well, it does. It happens plenty. But by the time I've gotten a bill all the way out of the Assembly, all the way up to the Senate onto the floor, that means a lot of people had to vote for it. And it probably isn't that controversial, and it's probably going to make it off the floor. I hope. You never know.
Is there a judicial committee in Assembly?
There isn't there's a judiciary committee that is made up of Assembly members that read and hear bills related to the judiciary, the judicial branch, and laws in California. But there isn't like independent judges who are kind of looking at what's fair and what happens. It's nothing fair. It's all rules that are in our Constitution, and then the rules of the body. I will also add to that answer. There's an office called Legislative Counsel. They are lawyers that work for the State Assembly, and they often will analyze a bill and decide this is a bill that requires a 2/3 vote, or this is a bill that requires majority vote.
And that's partisan or non-partisan?
Well, it's nonpartisan, but the people who hire those folks are usually in the majority. But they are people of good integrity. The Legislative Counsel's office serves everyone, every assembly member. And so they are, I don't question their integrity for being partisan. They have their legal interpretation of a bill, and we might disagree. You know, there have been some bills that I think are a tax. They raise a tax. And if it's a tax bill, it has to pass by 2/3 majority vote instead of simple majority. And sometimes the Legislative Counsel may look at it differently and say, that's not a tax, so it's majority vote. And when you're in the minority, you really don't get to change that opinion. That's okay. That's why elections matter. Yes?
So you mentioned about attending hearing.
Yes.
So in what situation you need to attend hearing? Like what's your role?
Sure. What situation, when do you attend hearings, and what's my role at a hearing? Great question. When all the assembly members introduce bills, those bills have to be heard by a committee that would have jurisdiction. So if I introduce a bill on transportation, like I had one earlier this year, that was to take all of the fees and taxes that are taken from us in the name of transportation and lock them into a box so they'd only be spent on transportation and not something unrelated. So I had a bill and I introduced that, and that is going to get referred to the Transportation Committee because that's the committee with jurisdiction. There's another committee that decides what bills go to which committee. They're called the Rules Committee. They get to decide which committee gets to hear it. So I had a bill 2 years ago on ending BART strikes. I didn't think it was right that there be BART strikes. That I thought would go to either transportation or local government committee or labor committee, and instead it went to the Committee on Retirement Systems, which has 7 members of the majority party and 2 Republicans, and it died there. Yeah, I mean, it would have died in any committee because it's not going to get. Well, I don't know. I'm not giving up on that one. Every year I reintroduce it, but it goes to. That's how they get decided. My role in committee is we'll have a scheduled hearing where all the bills that have been referred to the Transportation Committee will come up, and the author of the bill, which is the assembly member who introduced it, will testify, and he or she will have witnesses for the bill that testify, and they'll have witnesses against others, opponents will come up and testify against it. And then there's an opportunity for public comment, where you can go to Sacramento and you can get up before the microphone and say, I oppose this bill because this, and this. The chairman of the committee decides how much time you get to have, and he or she gets to decide how many questions I get to ask, but generally, when I'm in a committee, I prepare by reading the bills that are coming up for a vote, and then looking at the analyses, and then I ask questions in the committee, and then I vote in committee. If a majority of people vote for the bill, it gets to go to the next stage of the process. If it doesn't get majority vote, it dies. So that's my job, and that's how committees work. A lot of the work is done in committee, and relatively fewer bills are actually make it to the floor, where everybody, all 80 assembly members vote on it. Does that answer that one? Yeah.
So you have any hearing conference or any kind of...
The conference committee?
Pre-hearing, right? Before the hearing.
Pre-hearing. Generally, no. Maybe local government does that, yeah. We may have our, let's say, I'm vice chair of the Higher Education Committee, so I feel a little bit of responsibility to the colleagues on my side of the aisle to make sure they're fully briefed on the bills and that we kind of know how everybody else on my side is going to vote, so that we're not sitting up in the committee 5 seconds before the vote all asking each other what we're doing, because I don't think that's very deliberative. And the majority party often has maybe a briefing for their staff and members on the bills. And then when we have the hearing, that's everybody at once on both sides. But there's no pre-hearing. Yeah. I mean, there might be some secret meetings I get only invited to, but yeah. Yes, and then one more back there. Last one.
Asian Americans, in general, very care about education.
Yes.
And you are in the education committee. This is very critical.
Very, very important issue.
And your constituents have a lot of Asian population.
Yes.
So now I would like to have your opinions about the past one is SCFI. And
yes.
It's very, very sensitive. You may not have enough time.
I have a very strong opinion about that issue.
But I just kind of like to remind or suggest you may need a hearing for yourself.
Yeah.
Because in the future, last year, California passed the ethnic disaggregation.
I remember.
Act.
It was very active in that
debate.
Yeah,
and other new immigrants kind of like very unhappy about that.
Yeah.
So for yourself, you needed more information. And since your constituents have so many new immigrants.
Yeah, and very passionate feelings about the issue.
Yes, yes.
It's one of the reasons I have an Asian American Advisory Council. And I have different ones where we go over the bills. And also just by staying connected with the community, I have very strong opinions on SCA 5. And that's how some of us in this room got together originally and connected, because I felt very strongly that that was the wrong policy for the state. And then there's been a couple of versions of that aggregation and disaggregation of ethnic data in state forms. And the bills have in the past started off really awful. And by the time we put political pressure on, they get watered down. It's like, okay, this is fine. There's an issue that I'm looking into for legislation next year that I may author. I want to do all the research on it to find out what happens. But right now, the state law requires that local school districts ask for ethnic information, but they only disaggregate the Asian American category. And I don't know why they think they need to do that. And they only list 7 Asian subcategories instead of, say, 50 or...
Based on the Census Bureau, it's about 50 something.
What I've seen, just for China alone, there were many. And I spoke very passionately against legislation like that on the assembly floor last year. When it came back over, it was changed dramatically and narrowed to only for health policy purposes, which can be a little bit different. Yeah, right. The determination of benefits from the state based on, and opportunity based on your racial or ethnic identity, to me is a policy the state should avoid. If it's health related, and there's a health care policy issue, I'm open to looking at it. I'm just going to scrutinize it very, very carefully. And that was the difference in that bill. So I thank you for that feedback, and that's one of the great examples of why you should really be in touch with your community and listen, especially if you don't have exactly the same shared background, because you need to make an extra effort to get that input. So thank you. I think the last one in the back, yeah.
Which bill are you most proud of having authored and gotten passed?
Okay, which bill am I most proud of having authored and gotten passed? And that one comes to mind very quickly. Last year I had 9 bills in my first term signed by the governor and no vetoes. And I'm proud of all of them. The one I'm most proud of was AB 1058, which is to do a better job of preventing child abuse of our children in public school. We had many headlines in our community about kids who were horribly abused, either sexually or otherwise physically, in some school setting, either by a school professional or someone who got onto campus. And I learned that our schools were not equipped and were not doing as much as they could to prevent that. And so I introduced legislation to require that type of information, that better training, those better prevention policies to better protect our kids so that there isn't something that happens. And what I have learned is it's only as good as its implementation. So I, every quarter, meet with the Department of Education to say, what are you doing to implement this bill? But I'm very, very proud of that bill. There are those bills that you know are going to make life better because you'll get more parking at the Dublin, Pleasanton, BART station. You'll have a better commute. We'll have better open space and cleaner environment. And then there are the ones that I know there is a real person who could have been harmed badly, who is less likely to be harmed now because of a bill. For this year, one that I'm very proud of that hasn't been signed yet, but I'm hoping for, is also in the same area. A child who is the victim of the worst type of sexual abuse has to testify against their abuser in person for many hours, and sometimes more than once, at a pre-trial stage, at a summary stage, and at trial. Children who are the victim of, still very bad, but maybe not the most egregious, I'm not saying they're not just bad, they can testify by video. Well, I think the kids who are subject to the worst, and I won't even name the crimes that are done to them, should be able to testify by video the same way as others for lesser crimes. And again, that won't be a big headline one. It won't make us drive down the freeway faster. I'm working on that. It will help kids who go through a trauma again and again and again by having to confront their abuser through detailed testimony where they're cross-examined by opposing counsel. So, thank you for asking that one. Good. Thank you, Andy. That was wonderful. Really wonderful. Yes, one more.
Yeah, it's just, I think as a host, I would like to have one more question. I always ask a lot of the money things. So I want to ask you, I know it's like school board, city council, they don't have a salary. I know assembly member has a salary, so I don't know how much. Also, it's like, I want to know more about money. So like, what's the budget for your office? Like how many staff you can have?
Oh, hey, great. These are great questions. So how many staff do I get? What's the funding? And what is the salary for an assembly member? Because school board and city council, they get a very small stipend. Very small. This is a full-time position. There is a salary. I believe the base salary for assembly members is $97,000. But there's an extra payment that assembly members can get. It's called per diem, Latin word, which means for the day. It's called per diem. It is about $30,000 to $38,000 a year tax-free. It is extra salary that is intended to reimburse the assembly member for their expenses of traveling to Sacramento, staying overnight in a hotel, and meals. Just like when you work for an employer and they tell you to go to New York, they should reimburse you for your flight, your lunch, and your hotel room. And I would be fine with that if that's what it is. But the per diem is manipulated so that members get a maximum amount even when they're in their district. So if I could get paid that per diem payment, it's almost $200 a day, even if I'm at home, staying in my home, eating my own lunch, and not traveling for work, if I voted on a bill within 3 days. That's manipulation to maximize the tax-free money going to the legislator, which I find wrong. I think we should just have a regular reimbursement system, just like every other employer does. There's only 80 of us. They ought to be able to figure it out. And so I decline per diem. And I should have asked my husband before I did that, because it is tax-free, and it is reimbursement. So I get reimbursed for one of those round-trip drives to Sacramento and back. Even if I drive every day, I only get reimbursed for one. And so that's the salary part. That is a very generous salary as far as I'm concerned as taxpayers. In our area, you can decide about the cost of living. But the per diem part is what I find egregious, and I think that should change. How much budget do I have? That depends on which party you're in. The majority party gets about triple the budget that minority party members get. What happens is the state assembly gets a budget of money, and the speaker decides how much goes to a Republican caucus and how much goes to the Democratic caucus. Republican caucus allocation has not been increased in over 20 years. And so our leader has to divide it up among members. And this is, when you're in the majority, you get the benefits of being the majority. I'm really not trying to criticize my colleagues, but it's just a fact that they get dramatically larger budgets. And some of them get extra pay when they chair what's called a select committee. So I listed the 5 committees I serve on. They're standing committees. That means they always exist. But there's also sometimes these special committees. Like, I think this year I'll have a committee on winemaking. Now, I represent the wine industry, so I do want to be on that committee if it deals with any policy issues. But only the majority party chair will get extra staff and extra pay, and that committee never has to meet. So I'm not trying to make people upset, but that's what goes on in Sacramento. I get a little bit, I have more staff than other assembly members. Many work part-time. We have a lot of volunteers. We have terrific interns. I get a little bit more staff. We are a little bit closer to the Capitol, so folks don't have to live in Sacramento. They can live here and work here. But we have, the minority party has much smaller offices and much smaller staff and much lower budgets, and that's part of being in the majority. I'm not whining about it. I got my eyes wide open. This is a job I signed up for, but that's how it works. So, all right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I just learned this. I know what that salary, I think a few years ago. And I just want to let people know, I mean, to get elected, it's not like you earn a lot of money. It's more public service sacrifice. I think before you were elected, your salary is much, much more than that, right? As a lawyer. Also, I want to thank Assemblywoman Catherine Baker. She has two, is like a twins, right? One boy, one girl, and it's, you know, usually in the evening is time to visit kids, especially when you travel so much to the capital. So I really appreciate you, man. You spend the time with us, answer our question, give us, educate us for the kind of information about us as assembly member, and also the kind of how it works in the capital. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
We're off to go see them. Thank you. Have a great night. Good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Good to see you.
We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. It's wonderful.